It's a pleasure to be here and to be back here, as you stated. And I actually love these kinds of conferences because they're focusing on real important practical issues. And love these kinds of conferences because they're facing very important issues, and also the contribution of the National Bank of Poland and Rulesbased and the conversation that we've had generally. It's been, I think, very important. I've been interested in the use of economics and monetary policy for a long time, and there's no better way to get at this than through these kinds of conferences. So I have some slides I'm going to use, but to use the slides I need the machine, which is right here. Okay. So my lecture or talk is going to be about using models in monetary policy. Again, I've been interested in this for a long time. Maybe these are okay, or? In a long time, and I think the best way to get into this subject is to review some history. So I'm going to go back and look at some history, and I'm going to go back quite a ways. This is to 1936. That's actually a little before I was born, so it's not my own personal history, but it's an important history to think about. It's when macroeconomics, as we know it, as is used in central banks, I think really began. And of course, it was by Jan Tinbergen. And it's interesting to me because, in fact, it was used for monetary policy purposes. It was developed to answer a key monetary policy question, and that is whether the Dutch guilder should be devalued. Should there be a depreciation of the currency in order to stimulate the economy? The paper was prepared for the Dutch Economics and Statistics Association. Some of the current Dutch economists may remember this, but I doubt it. But what's interesting is the paper was available before it was presented and evidently available to the powers that be in the Netherlands. And so on 27th of September that year, 1936, the currency was devalued. The guilder went off gold by 20%. So in some sense, it was an analysis that was based on the model. Now, we never know, and I haven't been doing this for a long time, you never know to what extent the models or the theory guide policy. In fact, that's one of the things I want to talk about, but I think there's a good chance this had an effect. This type of analysis, I like to think of now as analysis in path space, and it had to do with instruments and targets, as you know. And the basic idea was to simulate this model, or other models eventually, for different paths of the policy instrument, say a devaluation of the currency, and then looked at the effect on the variables, would GDP rise or fall. And this basic approach caught on very rapidly around the world. In the United States, the Coles Commission was founded at the University of Chicago, and a whole lot of people gathered to think about how they were going to do policy analysis with these models. First of all, it was pretty clear at the start you needed to have some kind of a structural model. It couldn't just be a reduced form set of correlations. And that led to the question of how do you actually estimate these models? So full information maximum likelihood, two-stage least squares, limited information maximum likelihood. By the way, limited information maximum likelihood was developed by my thesis advisor, Ted Anderson, in 1949. Anyway, the models were used for many purposes, to compare monetarist views versus Keynesian views. And they developed quite extensively under people like Lawrence Klein. Eventually, it didn't occur overnight. The models began to be introduced at central banks. And the Federal Reserve, for example, began using the MPS model, that's MIT, Penn, SSRC, to do this work. And so they would simulate what would happen if money growth was stronger or weaker, what would happen if the exchange rate moved, all sorts of things. And other economies, other central banks began to do the same thing. In the Bank of Canada, their model at the time was called RDX1. I mentioned the Bank of Canada to some extent now because I understand the models used at the National Bank of Ukraine are related to that, and I'm going to come back to that, but we'll see. So another thing changed after this, and it was a paradigm shift, I would say, about how models are used in policy analysis. To me, this paradigm shift can be viewed as a move from path space, where you'd simulate one-time change in an instrument of policy, to rules space, where you'd simulate different contingency plans for the policies. And it began for many reasons. I think it actually had antecedents. I mentioned A.W. Phillips of Phillips curve fame, but he actually was looking at different policy reaction functions to see which worked better. Milton Friedman's original arguments that you had to have fixed money growth as a rule, people soon realized it was any feedback rule would be beneficial because it created some advantages. The idea that if you had a model, you didn't know the parameters, but you had to estimate it at the same time you're doing policy, gave rise to these ideas of contingency plans. And of course, probably most famously, the introduction of rational expectations, the Lucas critique, time and consistency created this idea that you needed to think about policy as a contingency plan, as a rule, as something that would continue over time, not just one place. Lucas critique, of course, argued that you couldn't possibly estimate the impact of a policy without thinking of a contingency plan to outline what was happening in the future. I also think it's important that you had these models, not simply neoclassical models or new classical models, but models that incorporated rigidities of some kind, because the impact of monetary policy so often depends on that. I listed some papers here, some with my thesis advisor, Ted Anderson, who, by the way, just died at age 98 and continued his research, Lucas, Kidlin Prescott, and some of my own work. Okay, so that was a shift. Underlying this shift, there was a development that I think is important for me to reflect on briefly. The models, these models were coming into practice, were quite complicated, many, many equations. And it began to give serious doubts about this approach, this rules-based approach, because the rules that came out of these models were unbelievably complicated. And it looked like it wasn't going to work. This notion that you had to be rules-based in your policy, and you had to be formal about it, using models to the best you could. It looked like it wasn't work because they were so complicated, no central banker could possibly make use of it. So it raised this question is, could there be some simple rules that were consistent with the theory, consistent with the ideas that weren't so complicated, and that policymakers could at least think about using? And that was where things like the Taylor rule came from. So first of all, the answer was yes. And it looked like, as a close approximation, the interest rates would simply react to real GDP and inflation in a particular manner, which is in the rules. It was important to set an inflation target. You couldn't have a rule without an inflation target, so you had to choose an inflation target. We chose 2%. That's a long time ago. Many central banks now are moving towards 2%, if not there already. The research also showed that the instrument should be the interest rate. That had to do with uncertainties of measuring money demand or technological changes, and that the interest rate should react to inflation by greater than 1. It's sometimes called the greater than 1 principle. I chose 1.5. Interest rate reaction should be also to the GDP gap. It had to be greater than 0, choose 0.5. And the interest rate should not include other variables, should not include reactions to other variables. And that's a pretty important thing, because how could you not react to the exchange rate? How could you not react to stock markets? All those things. Well, it turned out that many of those reactions caused instabilities because the interest rate would move around too much. So that's the basic idea. And again, the idea is to simplify things from these complex models. You also had to have a notion of a normal interest rate, the so-called equilibrium interest rate, it's called now. 2% was about the average of the time, looking just at the United States. And that was not too different from the potential growth rate. So that created this 4% nominal normal rate, 2 for the inflation rate and 2 for the real interest rate. And that's basically where it is. So the rule was to set the interest rate equal to 1.5 times the inflation rate, plus 0.5 times the GDP gap, plus 1. That's it. Amazingly simple. And I say this now because it comes from the models. This was not like a curve-fitting exercise where you did a regression. If you did a regression, you would not have gotten that. These were not the greatest of times. So it came from the models, and in the same sense, I think our work in the future should be coming from models in the same way. I mentioned the last point here that it worked internationally. I have to say that was an incredible surprise, because we're thinking about policy for the United States. Now, the models were multi-country models, and you could say there was something international, exchange rates were in them, but surprisingly, it seemed to be a close approximation in other countries as well. Thank you. So, this paradigm shift that I just described, both the models and the simplicity, began to affect central banks. And it didn't occur instantaneously, but here's a quick review. By the early 1990s, the Fed replaced its MPS model with something called FRBUS, Federal Reserve Board US. FRBUS is the nickname. And I have some quotes here of people describing it at the time, because it was really bringing in these newer models. So it says, so Braden and Tinsley, expectations of private sector are explicit. These expectations constitute a major transmission channel of policy. So that's a new development in the central banks. And some of the people working on this at the time, John Williams, Andy Levin, I list here, they got their training at Stanford working on models with me and others. I also list the Bank of Canada, because roughly the same time they're introducing this RDX model that replaced their quarterly projection model, which I mentioned a minute ago. And I have a quote from one of their researchers: two important features of this model's forward-looking expectations and endogenous policy rules. So this was getting into central banks. And I also mention here the National Bank of Ukraine quarterly projection model, because while I don't know that model very well, to say the least, the write-up seemed to say it comes from, at one point in time, the QPM model of the Bank of Canada. And I give some references here that describe what that model is. But I would say it's of that same genre, same type of model used at other central banks. And that's actually a very important thing to think about when we analyze the use of central banks models. Okay. What's important, I think, to recognize is that many central banks develop models. Many people developed models during this period of time, but they had some surprisingly similar features to them. And I'm going to list models that come from Volker Wieland's model database. He's at the University of Frankfurt and has an enormous number of models he's looking at. But these are all models that existed before the financial crisis, because there's been a divergence since then, so you can see the similarity. So I just list some well-known models here. These are small calibrated models. Calibrated meaning they're not really estimated directly. Some estimated models of the US. I have some models here in red, because I'm going to come back to them briefly, but at the ECB, the Smets-Waters model, the Cristiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans model, contributions by Lind, the Grave model, which actually has some financial frictions in it. And then these estimated models of the euro area, estimated small open economy models. I mentioned the Bank of Canada's model in red. This is actually a somewhat more updated model from the QPM model. And then there's a very old model, my own multi-country model, which is an example of estimated models for many countries. Now, to show that there's a great deal of similarity, which is important to recognize, I think, about these models, I took a policy rule, which comes from the Smets-Waters model. It has the interest rate reacting to the lagged interest rate, to the inflation rate pi, to the GDP gap y, and to the lagged GDP gap y minus 1, with a possible policy error. And then you can see the extent to which the models are similar by shocking the policy error. So what if the policymakers do something to their epsilon and see what happens? And so these are the results, which I think is pretty amazing. So there's a whole wide range of models, and I took some because I can't examine 50 at one time. But on the left, you see the impulse response function of a policy shock, in this case, an increase in the interest rate compared to what the policy rule would say. So that's on the left. It goes up, comes back, it converges back down. And on the right, you see the impact on output and inflation. And the timing is very similar to the output gap. There's a little difference in the size. The one that has the biggest impact way on the right is the model that includes some financial sector financial accelerator models. And the effect of inflation seems to me also very similar, at least from what I know about models. These are quite similar. So there's a great degree of similarity about this new, then new policy framework. There was lots of complaints about this, to be sure. One famous complaint was that it's ridiculous to think about the policy rate set by a central bank directly affecting consumption and spending. Of course, it affects other interest rates and exchange rates and asset prices. And of course, that's true. But for the most part, it was only the textbook examples which just had the policy rate directly feeding into consumption or investment. In most models, there were more complicated term structure equations. Another complaint was, oh, these models assumed away financial frictions, which is important now because there's lots of work on bringing in financial frictions, which I'll discuss. I think to some extent that was an exaggeration. There were some financial accelerator models. I mentioned one at the time. The results weren't that much different if you simulated it. And of course, a big complaint now about those models is they didn't have a zero lower bound. But the truth is they did. There was a lot of work on a zero lower bound, and all the simulations that we did with these models to get policy rules in the 1980s, the zero bound was taken into account. You basically, when the interest rate hit usually 1%, you kept it at 1 and then resorted to just simple money growth rules. So it was in there. It wasn't mentioned that much. And of course, there's a very, I think, important paper written by David Reifschneider and John Williams back in 2000, well before the crisis, well before the zero bound was a big topic, and they described how you would deal with a zero bound. Basically, when it hit zero, you would promise to keep the rate low for a little while longer, and that would affect the whole term structure. So it was there and part of the framework. I think perhaps most important is this framework worked. And that's my assessment, but other people's as well. There's work by Clarida, Galley, and Gertler, which documented a change in policy because of this framework, or again, you'd never know what causes a change, but it's the same time of the framework. Quite an improvement in policy results compared to the 70s, which in the US was a very unstable time. The 80s and 90s were much better. Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, called this the nice period for non-inflationary, consistently expansionary. It has other names like the Great Moderation. Very importantly for policy here, the emerging market countries went to the same approach through inflation targeting. And the most famous examples early on are New Zealand and Chile. But what we need to think about in the sense of arguing this is the same framework is that inflation targeting from the very start had to think about a policy rule or a way to operate it. So I quote here from a former governor of the Bank of Chile, Jose de Gregorio, and I'll just quote, the inflation target is an efficient framework to conduct monetary policy. The issue then is how to operationalize this framework. When should monetary policy be tightened or loosened? And the most straightforward answer is the Taylor rule or some policy rule. It doesn't matter which one, but you have to think about the rules-based policy if you have an inflation target. At least that's how the practitioners viewed it, and I think that's still the case. So the framework worked in many respects. I'll just give you a couple charts. This is from New Zealand, inflation rate coming down at the time they introduced inflation targeting, and has stayed pretty low through this whole period of time. This goes from 1960 to the present. And now it's fluctuating at around 2.5%. This is the picture for Chile. I thought I'd go back to 1960 for Chile because they had an inflation rate of 500%. But unfortunately, the chart makes invisible all the movements that occurred since then. So this is a chart since that peak there occurs, goes up to 500%. But if you look at a more recent period, going back to only 1980, you can see the impact of inflation targeting in the Chilean economy, beginning around this time where it was put in place. And it has been pretty good since then. Some ups and downs, but you would expect that. And I'll put this chart here up because even though it's not historical in the same sense as New Zealand and Chile, the story is so far similar. So this is a picture of the national Bank of Ukraine. This comes from IMF calculations. This actually comes from a paper just completed by the IMF just last year. And it shows kind of the same kind of story. Inflation is very high, 50, 60%. Inflation targeting is put in place, and the interest rate is shown by the discount rate there, the dark line, and inflation starts to come down, and it's down substantially. Of course, the target is 8 now, then it's going to be 7 and then 5, maybe it's 8, 6, and 5, but anyway, it's going to 5 plus or minus 1. But that's part of the same story, I think, and so I want to put that, even though it's historically out of sync right now. Okay. So I think if you look at this whole period, you also find a very important observation is that when policymakers began, for one reason or another, to deviate from this framework, things didn't work so well. And there's not as much agreement about that as the first idea, is that when they got to this framework, it worked, but I think it's developing. So I've emphasized this a lot in my research, and it's important. Other people have supported it. I'll give you a few charts for this. One is that around 2003, 4, and 5, first in the U.S., interest rates got lower, too low for too long. That stimulated a search for yield, excesses in the housing market, loan growth quite strong, and eventually when the crash happened, it was quite severe. There is econometric evidence for this that Alex here in the first row is involved with. But it's also global, so it's not just the United States. And I want to show you a few pictures to illustrate this. Okay, just a few. So this is from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. This is from the Federal Reserve of the United States, but the St. Louis branch. And it's by William Poole, who was the president at the time. And he shows the close association between the interest rate decisions of the Fed, which are shown there in black, and the policy rule. In this case, he's looking at the Taylor rule in blue. He has a dotted line in part of the Taylor rule because when he did this, he could not display the Fed's estimate. It was still confidential. It's not confidential anymore. But you can see quite clearly that the actual interest rate fell below what a rule that was quite descriptive in the 80s and 90s would suggest. So that's an example. This is a more updated version. This is by Bloomberg News. They look at the actual rate in the solid line and the policy rule rate in the dotted line. You can see it's too low by this measure in 2003, 4, and 5. Sorry, there's not more detail on the horizontal axis. And in some sense, that continued, it has continued recently. So it's not ended just yet, and in fact, it's spread. This is a picture from the Bank of Canada, Timothy Lane, which shows, I think this is another way to look at this. It's a busier picture, excuse me, but he looks at both the output gap and the financial gap. So financial gap is measuring instability in the financial sector. And he has decisions made by central banks represented by their flag. So you can see the U.S. is the American flag. It's listed under case 1. So during this period before the crisis, there was not enough tightness measured by the macroeconomic gap, that's inflation and output, but there's also not enough based on the financial stability. So it was too low in both dimensions. And I think if it were adjusted to be right in the macro dimension, it would have been right in the financial stability dimension as well. Anyway, it's another way to look at this, and there's many others. This is an example of the international impacts of this. This is a picture of the interest rate set in the Eurozone. This is produced by the OECD, and they look at the deviations from rules-based policy on the horizontal axis. They look at the Taylor rule, deviations from the Taylor rule summed up over this period from 2001 to 2006, and then they look at the extent to which there's a housing boom. It's quite remarkable, quite frankly. Ireland, Greece, and Spain, the countries which have had so many problems, are both way off in terms of the policy rule. Interest rates were too low then, and you had this behavior in the housing market. So that was way back before the crisis really hit, but you can see the sources for that, I believe. And this is a picture from Alex's work with his colleagues, and it's pretty amazing to me. This is a picture of how policies deviated from rules represented by the blue line, and how the performance of the policy has been. So they look at this discrepancy measured by the height of the blue line, and they note that in periods where there's not much of a deviation, the results are much better than where there is a deviation. And so the pink areas are where there's a deviation, and the white area where there's not. And then you can actually look at the impact on inflation stability and output stability measured by the quadratic differences between the targets, target 2% inflation, target U star being the natural unemployment rate. And it's quite remarkable, I think, based on their calculations. So there's other ways to do this, but it's an example of how policy moved away from rules-based policy and how the effects have not been that great. So, let me give one other example. So inflation targeting began in Brazil, too, a little bit later than Chile and New Zealand, but in the early 2000s, and inflation did come down. But as you can see, they're sort of lost it a bit, and inflation's picked up in Brazil. We don't know all the reasons for that, but clearly policy got off track. And so there's a problem here in the sense of, at least this theory tells you when policy should be good. It also tells you when policy is not so good, but there's all sorts of reasons why it might deviate from that. But this is just the data of Brazil. Okay, and then finally, internationally, this chart I think is helpful. This is from the BIS. Yun Shin, who's at the BIS, has calculated the policy rates that have been set on average since the mid-90s, both globally on the left and emerging markets on the right. And it compares that to policy rules. It's one policy rule again. It's an average across these countries. And you can see it's almost the same kind of picture as I showed for the United States. And it's too low going into the crisis. It's about right during the crisis, and then become too low again. And so this is a global phenomenon that's happening. And I think for the most part it occurs because central banks do tend to follow each other a bit, or maybe other reasons that you can think of, but it's definitely there. It's quite striking. So those are the examples. So to me, just to sort of summarize the history, we have a lot of evidence of what works and what doesn't. I think there's controversy about the last part of this still, because there's not a complete agreement about why we had the great global financial crisis. There's not complete agreement of why performance has not been so good in general since then. But this correlation says that it has to do with policy. And the first part, I think, again, a lot of agreement, moving from chaotic ad hoc policy to more rules-based, and that includes the inflation target movement, was beneficial, and it's still beneficial for countries that are using it, as you see, but for countries that haven't, it's not been so good. And the proof that we've gone off track is we're still working on it, but I think that it's pretty clear. So what this suggests to me is when we do policy at central banks, we want to kind of remember how this began in the first place, and that was by using these models. And to me, the history suggests you want to get back to, if you're not there, and stay in this rule space area. It was good, as I've shown, and it may even be good that we're expected to get back. But what can we do, both on the inside and outside of central banks, to encourage this? And that's where I want to wrap up. It's kind of a long wrap up. But I want to go through some ideas. And I have 7 ideas, actually. 7 ideas of how to do this. So the first is to think about the use of models at central banks in this rules-based framework. Okay, and it doesn't, in fact, it doesn't always happen, because once you have a model, you can do anything with it. It doesn't have to be you're looking at policy rules. So one way to think about this is to determine how changes in models affect policy rules. There have been changes in models to some extent because of the financial crisis. How do these affect policy? That should be a question. So I have an example here from the Handbook of Macroeconomics, which I recently edited with Harold Uhlig. This is a paper by Lynn Smets and others. And they note, and I'll show you the picture, they note that the models did not explain the sharp recession in 2008 and 9. And so that's the picture of not explaining it. The projections are shown at the higher level with some bands, and the actual are below. So as a result of that, there's been a lot of work to modify the models, bring financial considerations into account, collateral issues, financial accelerator. Example, which I already mentioned, is the Grau model. But since then, Cristiano, Model Rossignano, Jacobello, Neri, many people are bringing financial considerations into the models. So the question is a question should be, how do these changes affect the policy rule or strategy? And there's some work on this too, and so Volker Wieland and some of his colleagues have investigated it. I won't go into details. Again, this is in the new handbook of macroeconomics. But what they did is they say there's these new models which are listed on the top. There are new models. Those are the code names for the models. How do these models, are these going to be better if policy reacts to credit? Because credit's in these new models. It's a financial, so is it going to be better if it reacts, or going to be worse? So that's thinking about policy in terms of rules. So this picture, this chart shows that it gets better if they're leaning, meaning reacting to credit, in some of the models, as long as you don't lean too much, but not all the models. It's not uniform. But there's something to be said there that maybe with these modifications, the policy rules should be different. This needs to be more work on this, but if it's the case, then that suggests policy is going to be different than before. So that's an example. You're looking at rules questions with the models. Second idea is to relentlessly check for robustness, for any new policy rule, any deviation from a policy rule. I can't say this is probably more important than anything, because there's so many models out there, and everybody's inventing a new model every day. It's fun. I love to do new models. I don't really care what the other models are like, right? But the point is, as a policymaker, you got to care. So there's this great model comparison project by Volker Wieland, which I mentioned, which is a great source for analysis. So this is a very busy table. It comes from one of these papers, but you can just look at it with me to see what they're doing. So they're looking at a bunch of different policy rules. Some are model specific. They're optimal for a particular rule. Others are simple. They're sort of more general, like the Taylor rule, the Smets-Vatters rule. And then these various rules are then tested out in a whole bunch of these new models. And you can see, does the old model work very well? And of course, there's a huge discrepancy. Some of them have an infinite loss. That's probably not something you'd like to use unless you find out why it's giving an infinite loss in that model. But of course, you can get a very good performing policy reaction function or rule or strategy that's optimal in one model, and it'll fall apart in another model. And this Orphanides-Williams 08 rule, OW08 rule, illustrates that, because it's really good performance in the first model, but it's infinitely bad in a couple of other, in the other one. So that's robustness, and I think it's important for central banks to do this. And one thing that's noteworthy, it's not that hard. It's, this is a system or a set of programs that you can basically press a button and see how it works in different kinds of models. That's the second idea. Third idea is to design models explicitly to evaluate policy rules. That doesn't mean every model should be that way. You know, time series models, vector autoregressions are not so good for this. They're really reduced form models, or things that we learned many years ago don't work. They're not structural. The coefficients change. But if you think about at least some of the models, the purpose of this model is to evaluate a strategy for the central bank. That's what its purpose is, and you're going to keep doing that. I think that goes a long way to keeping the connection between the policy and the models in this, and working in rules space, not path space. Next idea, I'm losing track of the numbers, and maybe this is the most important. Okay, so this has to do with worrying about the interface between the researchers that are working with the models and the policymakers who are making the decisions. It can be very separate, it can be very integrated, but the point is, how can you make it more integrated? I'd say, I give an example here, one from the Fed. The Fed has a statement of longer run goals on monetary policy strategy. It's on their website. If you look at that, you'll see lots of goals stuff, 2% inflation, et cetera, maximum employment, but there's almost nothing describing the policy, the reaction of the instrument of policy to bring about this goal. ECB has a similar document. It's simply called strategy. But if you look at that, it's almost all about goals and very little about the strategy to achieve the goals. So I think it's important to think of a strategy. Now, what I noticed is recently the National Bank of Ukraine has a similar thing. It's called Objectives and Tasks for Monetary Policy. But what I think is quite encouraging, in this case, there's actually a statement about what the strategy is, what the policy is. At least it's a beginning, and maybe it's not your favorite strategy or mine, but it's there. And I just read it. The main monetary policy instrument and the operational target under such a monetary framework is the interest rate. So that's the instrument. If the projected inflation is above targeted level, the central bank pursues a tight monetary policy in order to contain inflation. That is, the interest rate is raised. That is a strategy. That is a reaction function. It could be more detailed, of course, but it's in the right direction. And then they show the converse. So this is what I mean by the interface between the models doing technical things with rules and algebra and the policy, which is not necessarily technical, but it's connected. I think that legislation may help this. In fact, I've been arguing in the US that if the Congress asked the Fed to report its strategy, it would help things. And that's a proposal for the Fed. It's now a bill which has passed the US House of Representatives. It may pass the Senate. It may be signed by the President. But it's in the direction. And I actually quote again from a Vox Ukraine article from Alex. So I just read this. The Rada would have to legislate the National Bank of Ukraine's commitment. Obeying any reasonable rule would prevent the NBU from taking populist measures to maintain credibility in the future. Switching to a rules-based policy might be the solution. It would improve transparency for the governor to explain why. So that's another proposal, and it's not there yet, but it's in the same purpose, I think, is to have a focus on the rules or strategy and the interface between the models and the policy. Okay, my next idea is to remember the obvious thing. This is a global economy. It's not just one central bank. Actually, I think the work between central banks that I referred to is important here because you're automatically thinking about the connection between central banks. I think there's been a lot of instability globally that the deviation from rules has helped bring about. And I showed you that chart about the global deviations from policy rules. So the simple idea is to expand on this idea of rules-based policy for individual countries and to think about an international system where each central bank would be stipulating its strategy. Models are very helpful here. In fact, there is an old theorem, which I think is very important, that says that if each central bank stipulates its strategy for the interest rate setting, or whatever their instrument is, and other central banks do the same and recognize it, it creates it's Nash equilibrium in the sense it's not global, but it's nearly the global optimal. I also mentioned there's some other people interested in international reform. Paul Volcker, Raghu Rajan, who is the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi said just last year, we would all clearly benefit from improving communications over our reaction functions. So it's the same idea that perhaps this concept of focusing more on strategies or rules would be a way to create a more rules-based international monetary system. So my next to last idea is to distinguish, and this is a issue that is, I think, controversial, but to distinguish between policies which are based on instrument rules, like I've been advocating here, and policies that are sometimes called constrained discretion. So constrained discretion usually means that it's only necessary for the central bank to set its target or its goal, say inflation's 2%, and then they'll take care of it. Don't worry, don't bother us. We're gonna take care. We'll get that 2%. And that's called constrained discretion because you're constrained by the goals. There's no real obligation in that framework to set the strategy or describe the strategy of the policy instruments. So I think it's a problem because to some extent that approach has led us astray. I think that's to some extent true of the Federal Reserve in the 2003, 4, 5 period. It's an appealing term, to be sure. Sounds pretty good, constrained discretion. But I think it doesn't really induce this rules-based policy as the term seems to suggest. And again, there's evidence for that. And I think just to be careful and just to distinguish these two, have a discussion of the two with the central bank decision makers and the economists, I think is important. And so my last idea is really obvious, I guess, is to make sure that your models are able to test alternative hypotheses about what goes right and what goes wrong. So my story here that a big problem has been the deviation of policy. Problem has been policy, not completely, but to an extent. But there are other views, to be sure. And many central bankers think there's other views. There's a famous set of papers by the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, and the current governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who go through an alternative explanation that the markets got off track. This is what it's a market phenomenon about the way markets operate, not really the central bank. So I think it's very important to try to test those. I gave you my view, but there are other views. Another thing is to test different hypotheses. Raghu Rajan, who used to be the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, has a proposal for rules-based policy internationally. And his simple idea is that policymakers, or maybe international policymakers, should distinguish between red, yellow, and green policies. Green policies are ones that don't have a lot of impact abroad, and red are ones with big impact abroad. And you should steer your policy towards ones that don't have a lot of impact abroad. To me, this is my view, the green tend to be more rules-based and the red tend to be more discretionary, but there's other ways to do it. But the main thing is to think about models in this international sense and looking for ways to test the different hypotheses. So I'm going to conclude. Hopefully there's a couple of questions. What I tried to do is summarize a history of macro models. It goes back a long time, 8 decades, and noted the change from this path space analysis, where you sort of one-time changes in the instruments, to rules-based analysis. I think it's pretty fundamental. That shift occurred about 40 years ago. Central bank models tended to adapt to that change with a lag, to be sure, and that's always going to be the case, I think. Central banks need to decide what things they're going to incorporate in their framework, although that lag can be made a lot shorter with recent technology. I believe there's been a retrogression for some central banks around the world, not all, of course, and as a result, performance has not been as good as it could. My conclusion from this is that we need to get back to a more rules-based policy. That's actually beginning to happen, I believe, in the United States through this normalization process. Maybe that will bring about changes in the Bank of Japan and the European Central Bank. We'll see. But even if we do that, I think it's important to think about ways to stick to that and not to deviate again, and I gave some ideas. I'd say that, to me, the 3 most important of those 7 is to think about this interface between the decision makers and the modelers. I mean, it's so hard to do that in practice, but work on that. Second is to mention the connections between optimal good policy in one country and the global situation. And the third, this emphasizing robustness, there is not one good model. We never know which one is right. So make sure your results or your theories, your policies are not dependent on the exotic properties of one model, that they work pretty well in a range of models. And we can do that better, much better than we could 40 or 50 years ago. So thank you.
Thank you indeed, Professor Taylor, for this excellent presentation. I would say it's not only insightful but also encouraging, because you have been referring to the research made by some people in this audience, Alex, my colleagues from the National Bank, our colleagues from IMF, and so on. So we have some time for questions now. I assume there would be a lot of questions. I also assume that just managing to ask the question to Professor Taylor could enter as a separate line in your CV. But anyway, please be brief and precise, and 1 question per person, please. Yeah, that's it.
Hi, Michał Konstantinescu, Bank of Lithuania. Do you see any scope for accounting for the financial cycle in the existing rules?
Yes, definitely. So part of rules-based policy is a good lender of last resort policy, which is it's best if it's understood what the terms are for it. So that's an important role of central banks. I think there's also this connection between the interest rate being on track and financial stability. So I gave the example 2003, 4, and 5 in the U.S., the rate's too low by macro considerations, but you also had this financial instability. If you had the rate at the right level, so to speak, from macro, then would there still be financial instability? If there is, then you need to think about that. I think that probably the biggest practical question is what do you actually do? So there's a lot of discussion of macro-prudential policies, and to many degrees, those are policies where there's changes in capital requirements or loan-to-value ratio which move up and down depending on one's assessment of financial stability. So my view is that macro-prudential is important, but it's getting the level right that's most important. You have the right level of capital that reduces risk, minimizes financial instability. You have the right loan-to-value ratios in the regulations, and you don't move those around because it's very hard to move them around. You don't know the effects. We don't have very good models of it. The extent to which that's already happening, which it is, I think is to some extent related to these unusual policies. So for example, Singapore, they have roughly a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. So those low rates in the US cause low rates in Singapore. That creates a housing bubble and bubble in the automobile market. So they have to put on controls to prevent that from happening. So, but if there wasn't such an unusual policy, it'd be less of a chance. So that's my thoughts about financial stability.
Hello. Professor Tim, if you may share with us your views on the policies of the developed central banks, if it's more or less clear what we should expect from the Fed. Maybe you can say about Bank of England and ECB. As I understand, they slightly deviate from the rules-based policies.
Sure. Sure. So a lot of the rationale for the deviations has been the zero bound on the interest rate. That was the original. In 2009, the policy rules suggested negative rates, and so the unusual quantitative easing began at that point in the U.S. I think it extended too long based on policy rules that I would advocate, and so I've been suggesting for a while that the Fed normalize. And so they're starting to normalize now. I think that's good. They're doing it in a gradual, predictable way, which you want because you don't want to cause instability by that. They still have the large balance sheet, and they are beginning to talk about reducing its size maybe later this year. So I think that's also a good idea. In a way, it's sort of getting back to normal kind of policy that worked. So I think to some extent the policies in Europe and Japan, which are also quite, ECB in Japan, which are also unconventional, are related to that. So the original quantitative easing in the U.S. led to a very strong yen, it was 80 to the dollar. One of the reactions to that was to have quantitative easing in Japan. And so Abe was elected prime minister, and Haruhiko Kuroda came in as the governor, and they did their own quantitative easing, and the yen depreciated substantially, and it's still quite depreciated compared to then. European Central Bank, to some extent the same. In August 2014, Mario Draghi is speaking at Jackson Hole and mentions the strong euro, and quantitative easing then follows, and the euro depreciates substantially. So these are all related, I think. It's not the only things, because in both countries they have the rate either, they're negative actually in both countries, slightly negative. But I think it's related. So I feel that to some extent that's an international issue, and if the U.S. begins to normalize, it will influence to some extent. I don't know how, I don't know when, that's their decision, but it will begin to bring about a more normal situation globally. And small open economies, the story is very similar. Mexico I know very well, and countries in Latin America, since they're right next to the US, but it's the same kind of story. So I think that's it. Now there's different views about it. There's views that the equilibrium real interest rate has declined from 4, as I said I originally assumed, to 3 or 2 or something like that, in which case you're going to be at a lower level forever. I don't think there's sufficient evidence for that at this point, but that's out there to discuss. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you very much. Ukraine is quite enthusiastic about the inflation targeting. And we do believe here that the central bank should have only one goal, inflation one. While your rules links 2 goals for interest rate, inflation plus real GDP. So my impression is that your famous rule, in fact, undermines the inflation targeting approach as to have only one goal for the monetary policy. Thank you.
So it's a very good question. I think you have to distinguish the goal from what you do to achieve the goal. So you could very well have a goal of 2% inflation and find it's still optimal to react not only to inflation, but react to GDP. It would help you get a better performance of inflation. So that's one answer. Even if you had a single goal, it's, in most calculations, it's optimal to respond to employment or real GDP. But the other thing is, in most models or most estimates, there's kind of a short-run trade-off, and a rapid reduction of inflation or too much of a focus on inflation stability can cause instabilities elsewhere. That's an old result. And so that suggests to me that inflation targeting in practice is really more flexible inflation targeting, and it's a word that's used quite a bit, even for countries that just have inflation targets, because it's conceptually, you don't want to try to keep the inflation rate exactly at 2. I mean, that would be crazy. So there's movements around it, and to some extent you're doing it for these other goals. But it's also harder to describe. Inflation targeting is a term that everybody can understand, but in reality, it's flexible. And the US, as you say, has another specific goal, maximum employment, but it's hard to see how much that itself has changed, the policy. In the 80s and 90s, Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Fed, and then Greenspan. They almost never referred to this dual mandate. We got to get inflation down, and that's going to reduce unemployment. And Volcker would do that constantly. So even though it was there, they focused on the same kind of goal.
Thank you very much. My question is regarding your graph. You showed that central banks started to deviate from the rules quite a bit after the crisis. So the question would be, to what extent do you think is really deviating from the rule versus what we thought that the rule is? Because yesterday was a great presentation by Yuri Gorodnichenko. He showed that there was if you look at the revisions to output gaps and other unobservables after the crisis, they are just huge. So maybe it is not that they are deviating from the rules, but it's basically they are very slow to recognize the structural changes in the economy. One you just mentioned, which is the neutral interest rate may change. Another one is that probably potential growth was much lower after the crisis than they thought in 2009. So to what extent do you think it's basically not following the rule versus uncertainty in these unobservables, in the underlying productivity and potential of the economy?
So it's a very good question. I think Yuri's paper illustrates how difficult it is to estimate the potential GDP and the GDP gap. GDP gap goes into the rules, and so there's huge uncertainty about that. I think that makes monetary policy difficult, whether you have rules or whether you don't. You have to kind of have a sense of where you are. But I say, take the situation right now in the U.S. I unfortunately agree that we probably got a low potential has come down because of productivity growth or being low. I don't think it's permanent. I think a change in policy could move that. There's nothing, to me, there's nothing secular about that. It's just where we are. But with respect to monetary policy, it does show you know, 4.5% unemployment is not a situation where a big burst of demand policy is going to change that very much. So the policy would be get the Fed back to normal, which by most calculations is a higher interest rate, and then worry about other policies that we know have a better chance of increasing long-term growth than monetary policy. So those various kinds of reforms that we've been talking about in this whole conference, so important for every single country. But those are more structural, sometimes it's called, supply side it's sometimes called, but it's really not monetary. Monetary policy is very important to provide the framework for those kinds of policies so that markets operate well. And, but to me, the uncertainty about potential GDP is a problem for monetary policy, but it's not the problem I would focus on now at least for the developed countries.
Mr. Taylor, thank you for sharing your ideas. Today, as well as in your recent papers, you emphasize on legislative approach and legislative changes. And today, you show us that you propose this approach for National Bank of Ukraine as well. Could you specify how National Bank could implement explicit monetary rule as well as maybe other transition countries? Are there any restrictions or how speed of this process, something like that? Could you specify your ideas?
So I did two things. Yes, I have recommended that for the U.S. In fact, the legislation is related to is quite close to a proposal that I made. Legislation is always different from what you propose, so you never know where it'll end, but it's true. For the National Bank of Ukraine, I mentioned this statement. It's already in the policy write-ups, which has a strategic set of statements about how the policy instrument moves. So that's just, those are facts. That's what's in. With respect to legislation, I really referred to Alex. I don't really know how it would work in every other country. I know the U.S. I know the relationship between the Congress and the Fed. I know how the Constitution works. I know a lot of things, but how it would work in each country, I just don't know. I think that's something to look at.
Good morning. Thank you, Professor Taylor, for brilliant presentation now for us. I have one question about what do you think about shadow economy right calculation for Taylor rules? In Ukraine, we have official figure 35% in past year part of shadow economy. But money in circulation is served all economy, shadow economy and official economy. What do you think about forecasting of this process for Central Bank of Ukraine? Thank you.
So I'm not just quite sure how to answer it. It seems to me, I'll have the question in my head. I never thought about any policy rule as being permanent or fixed in stone. You do research and things are going to get better. I think, to me, the enormous amount of new work with big data and the ability to do nowcasting changes things a lot. We're getting much better. The Taylor rule involved knowledge of the current quarter that you're in, and you don't know the current quarter that you're in until after it's over. So that's so getting a better estimate of that would be better. So with respect to different kind of countries, different stages of development, it's even harder, right? Because the data aren't that good. So I'm sort of optimistic that eventually these things will improve, that there'll be more data. We're learning more and more about how to use it, high frequency, many different sectors. So I think it'll get better. I think that it'll be more reliable going down the road, and I think more research is better on it. It's kind of amazing that that this simple rule is still out there after all these years, quite frankly, because you know you could, you just imagine you could do better than that, but maybe it's the simplicity that's attractive. And you know, my feeling is many people come into central banks who've never been in a central, who are supposed to run it on policy committees or even governors. They haven't done much before, and so this gives a framework to thinking about it. There's a whole list of reasons to think about policy as rules-based or strategic. They're not just based on academic. They're very practical things. How do you explain it to people? How do you give some guidance to policymakers themselves? How do you have a discussion about things? So I'm not sure I answered your question directly, but I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Okay, we take two questions. Ladies first, and then another question on that side. No, ladies first. Ladies first, please. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Taylor, for your investigation and new aspects in analyzing monetary policy setting rule, especially in robustness testing. And my question will be concerned, how can you define the price stability mandate as economic criteria? Because it's very cautious for my doctoral thesis. Thank you very much.
So could you help me with that?
That's a question how you can define the mandate, the price stability mandate as a rule. Can you give microphone back?
How can you define price stability as economic criteria?
Okay. So how do you define price stability?
CPI.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. So
no, I mean
CPI should have some growth, some level. Yeah. So I mean it's a serious question.
A lot of people say it should be the core, because it doesn't fluctuate so much. That's your definition. Sometimes the problem with that is the core goes well off compared to the actual. I think the actual inflation rate, as best we can measure, is good. I think there's problems in measuring the inflation rate because of substitution bias, which is always out there. That's why the target is 2 in the Taylor rule, not 1 or 0. So I think that's not as big a question. Right now, the National Bank of Ukraine has going to 5% inflation target. Some people ask me, what about that? Well, let's see what happens when you're there. That's a good thing to be using in the meantime, but eventually maybe it would be lower, I don't know. So, but I don't think that's the main problem we have. We have problems in measuring the output gap, which we just asked about. You have measuring R star, the equilibrium interest rate. And the inflation rate seems to be less of a problem for me as I think about it as a issue with respect to policy. And by the way, all these questions about the target for inflation or R star, they're just as much of a problem if you don't have rules or strategies, right? But that if you have a rule or strategy to discuss it within, it helps. So just a quick example. I'm sorry it doesn't really answer your question that well, but there's a big debate about what R star is, in real terms, gone from 2 to 1 or 0 in the US. The chair of the Federal Reserve has given speeches about that. She frequently uses policy rules to discuss it. So she says, what if the Taylor rule had a different R star? What if a modified Taylor rule had a different R star? So it creates a good dialogue. And then people have reacted to that in civil society and said, well, yes, if you do that, you got to do this. And so that whole discussion, I think, is healthy in that context. It's kind of bringing in quantitative analysis into the policy, like this interface that I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Questions there, please.
Dr. Taylor, thank you for your talk. I'm Michael Lawton. I'm a current student at the Kyiv School of Economics. You mentioned the idea of deepening international monetary cooperation. And I was just wondering, in your opinion, what do you think are the prospects for that? And has the performance of the Eurozone helped or hurt those prospects? Thank you very much.
So I think the prospects are pretty good. I mentioned some people who have argued we need something like that. Some emerging market central bankers, some previous central bankers. So I think it's pretty good. I think it's better if there doesn't have to be a formal agreement. What's, I think, attractive about what I suggested is we don't have to, the United States doesn't have to tell the National Bank of Uruguay what kind of policy, of Uruguay or Ukraine, what kind of policy to have. That's their decision, as long as it's stipulated what it is. And in the past, coordination has not done that. So there's a famous coordinated policy in the mid-'80s, the Plaza Agreement. And in that case, the G5 countries persuaded Japan to take a different policy stance, and it wasn't good for Japan. So we don't want to do that. I think that creates problems. But if each country does it this way, it's kind of magical, right? It's very laissez-faire in a sense. You do what's right for you, describe what it is, and it turns out to be right in general. I think it's true. I'd like to see more work on it, but it's a nice way to get an agreement. You need to have someone oversight in terms of reporting requirements, commonality of the reporting, but you don't have to force any particular policy.
Fortunately, we had to finish soon, and I will just take the last question. Okay, please.
Thank you very much for your explanation. Could you please specify what kind of monetary policy Federal Reserve of United States pursue today? It's rule-based or strategy-based? If it's rule-based, what kind of rule they use? If it's strategy, what kind of strategy? Thank you.
So I'm never be telling the Fed to follow a particular rule. That would be a mistake, not in the spirit. It's their job to decide what it is. And I gave an example here, which I think is promising from the National Bank of Ukraine. I think the Fed has made statements similar to that. So it's going in the direction. It's going in the direction of a strategy. A little more history here. One of my stints in Washington was to work at the Council of Economic Advisors. That was a long time ago, but it was Greenspan was the chair of the Fed. And we did this annual report to the president, the annual report of the Council of Economic Advisors, called Economic Report of the President. And the 1990 report had a description, rules-based description of the Fed. It was actually kind of a precursor of the so-called Taylor rule. But it was words. It was words about regularly the Federal Reserve moves its interest rate under these circumstances. And it was important because that kind of document came out of the White House had to be cleared, in a sense, by other agencies, including the Fed. And so the Fed was happy with that. And it was in the direction of a strategy. It could be more precise. Like now they have a 2% inflation target. They could say what our star is in their view, so it can be more precise than in the past. And that's what I mean. But it's really, it's also important to note that in many central banks now, including this one, including the Fed, there's committees making the decisions. And for a committee to decide on a number, like an interest rate, even if there's some disagreement, is not easy, but it's doable, right? You get people together. Strategies could be, you could say a strategy is a little harder. You're describing a reaction function. And so a strategy is harder, I agree. So that's why I say it has to be worked through the system. I don't think it's impossible by any means. There are so many policies outside of monetary policy, even outside of economics, that you are better thinking them as a strategy versus tactics. International policy, national security policy, fiscal policy. So you're better off thinking about it in a more rules-based way. And we do that somehow when things are working well, even though there's many people participating in the decision. But it's a very good question, and I think that's a challenge for sure to make this whole thing work.
Thank you, Professor Taylor. That was a really excellent section. Indeed. Thank you very much.